I have a way of framing the discussion so that people will be open to it. And the basic thing I'm always doing is saying, look, would you agree that ultimately we want to take the course of action that's really best for human beings now and in the future? And then to do that, we have to look at the benefits and the drawbacks of all our options. We can't just look at the benefits of solar and the drawbacks of fossil fuels. We have to look at the benefits of fossil fuels and the drawbacks of fossil fuels and the benefits of solar and the drawbacks of solar. And almost everyone will agree to that framework. And then once you've framed the discussion, then people are more open to the facts. But if the discussion is not framed with a clear goal and clear rules of thinking, then people will default to being very biased against fossil fuels and very biased toward solar and wind, even though that's not really what they want to be. It's just that's the default. So I wrote this book called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and definitely until I was, say, 27, I would have never thought that I would write a book called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And I would certainly when I was young, I would think of this as bizarre. And I think part of the reason is, like, I'm 38. I mean, most people in my generation, I grew up in a liberal place, but I think even people who grew up in conservative places are taught that, like, fossil fuels are an addiction. They're a habit that we have. Maybe they're convenient, but they're leading us to environmental destruction. And why would we use them when we can use things like solar and wind and plants to get energy? I mean, that was certainly what I was brought up with. I grew up in a place called Chevy Chase, Maryland. So that's the Washington, D.C. area, which is not at all a pro-fossil fuel place. And I was fortunate enough to go to have a really strong math science background in training. I went to one of the top math science high schools in the country, and I was around a lot of really smart kids. And certainly my teachers were, if they talked about the issue, were certainly along the lines of fossil fuels are not a good thing. And science in some way has established that they're not a good thing. We should get off them. And one thing I noticed in retrospect is I had no idea of any positive of fossil fuel. Like, looking back, I see, well, it's interesting because all I ever heard were negatives about fossil fuels, and yet, given what I know now, I was using fossil fuels as a reason that, my three sisters and I probably have lived as long as we have, and so many things. But the way I was taught to think about it, being around a lot of scientific people, is just to look at, okay, what are these drawbacks? And if there are these drawbacks, then it's a wrong thing to use them. So that was definitely my background growing up with this issue. So
you pretty much came from the opposite perspective of what you have now.
Well, I certainly, my upbringing was, I was not, the perfect story I talk about in my book would be like if I joined Greenpeace or something like that, and then one day had an epiphany. But I was not, I'd say until I was like 15 or 16, I was just generally very sympathetic to the modern environmental movement and just straight bought into it. And then I started really studying philosophy. I became really interested in philosophy, in politics, and in particular, I was really interested in how can you think logically about these issues? I was taught to think logically in math and science and computer science. How can we think logically about these issues? And pretty early on, once I had that mindset, I found certain elements, at least of the free market position, to be more logical to me than the opposite position. And in particular, early on, the idea of individual responsibility really resonated with me. And I had a real issue with the tendency against individual responsibility. As I didn't have a fully developed philosophy, but that sort of pushed me into the more free market, what you might call libertarian side. And that led me to at least be open to there being issues with the modern environmental movement, which is often associated with liberals. So it's not as if I was a card-carrying Greenpeace member, but I certainly saw nothing really positive about fossil fuels, and I was certainly afraid of environmental catastrophe, particularly in terms of rising CO2 levels leading to destructive climate changes. That was on the back of my mind. That was in the back of my mind, and I didn't have any kind of answer to it, but I wasn't emotionally aligned with that whole, it wasn't like never my identity to be an environmentalist.
What was it about this specific discussion of like energy and the environment that drew you to that? Because there's a lot of issues you could probably have applied your philosophy or your political interests towards. Like I know, I see the headlines and I know the environment is a big topic, but it's not something I've necessarily been drawn to look into more. You obviously did.
Well, yeah, but it's interesting because it took a long time, because I only really got into it when I was 27, which is 11 or so years ago. And so when I was, 20, I guess when I became 18, I got really interested in philosophy in particular. And then I got particularly interested in what's called objectivist philosophy, which is Ayn Rand. I think you've had guests on from the Ayn Rand Institute. So, philosophy very focused on objective reality, rational thinking, individualism, individual freedom. And part of that is a very pro-human focus, like regarding human life as something like human life is a great thing. Human life is an important thing. It really, like, your happiness matters more than anything. I definitely had that philosophy. And I wanted to use philosophy to clarify different kinds of important issues in the world. And what's interesting is when I was 20, I decided this is what I want to do for a living in some form. And energy was the last issue on my mind. I just had no interest in it, no knowledge of it. And if you Googled my name and other subjects I wrote about every subject you can imagine before energy. I mean, biotech, cloning, foreign policy, digital stuff, net neutrality. And energy was just the last thing on my mind. And then when I was 27, I was doing some research for a talk I was giving, and it was actually on journalism. It was on the history of business journalism. And to understand the history of business journalism, I looked at certain case studies of how journalists had portrayed businessmen historically. And I looked at John D. Rockefeller. And when I looked at Rockefeller to understand Rockefeller, and basically was Rockefeller a good guy or a bad guy, I had to understand he took over the oil industry, so-called, people would call it that. Like, he dominated the oil industry. I had to look at, well, what was the oil industry like before Rockefeller? And I started reading firsthand sources of what was it like before Rockefeller. And then I started reading about what was life like before oil, because it's very similar points in history. And what I saw is, wow, there were people on the countryside who in 1859 had darkness at night. And then by 1864, just 5 years later, they had light. And this just blew my mind. I thought, what is going on? Like, how is this possible? What happened? And I realized, there are two realizations that I had that made me permanently interested in energy. And so one realization is that cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is essential to human flourishing. So I'll break that down. So cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. It's important that there were a lot of different forms of energy before Rockefeller and before the oil industry, but they weren't cheap, plentiful, and reliable, and therefore people didn't have access to them. They weren't abundant in the world. And once they had that level of energy, then what they could do, basically, is they could use all sorts of machines. In the broad sense, you can think of all machines as tools. Basically, we had tools and fuels, if you want to remember it easily. That's what all of modern life is we have these advanced tools, and then we have lots of fuel to power those. And I realized, oh my gosh, everything in my life is tools and fuels. Even me being here in this studio, coming from Laguna Beach, all of my pursuit of values is made possible by tools and fuels. And
when you talk about that in the book, it sounds so simple. Obviously, yes, everything, our entire lives are fueled by energy, but it's just something you never think about. And when you think about every single little thing, and you do this in the book, you break down the clothes you're wearing, the floor you're walking on, the door frames you're walking there. Everything in our lives today is being fueled by machines for the most part.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful to look at the contrast, to look at what was life like before we had advanced tools and abundant fuel, because there are basically 4 billion or 3 billion people in the world today living without that now. And you think of what's the quality of life for billions of people. And the two terms I would use are the wealthier people can generally experience what I call human flourishing, which basically means people living to their full potential. And I would characterize most of life throughout history as human languishing or human suffering. People are living short lives, and they don't have very much control of their lives. And if you think about what do you want out of life, when I say human flourishing, for a lot of people that captures that, like I want to flourish, I want to live to my fullest potential. What that means ultimately is that you live a long time and that you have a lot of control over the experience of your life. So basically, you do the activities that you want in the places that you want, with the people that you want. And it's important to recognize that nature doesn't give us any of that. In our natural state, we don't live a long time and we have very little control of our experience. So we don't have the activities we want. We're just basically in a subsistence state because we don't have tools and fuels. So we're helpless. We're in a state of basically of human helplessness. And part of the context of nature is that nature doesn't give us a good standard of living. So I think of it as there's a deficient planet. The planet is not this perfect, amazing Garden of Eden that gives us everything we need. So we have a deficient planet, and then we are naturally helpless. And that's why we suffer. That's why we languish. And what human beings did over time is they developed these amazing tools, and then they figured out how to fuel them, and then that empowered us. So I think of it as we went from human helplessness to human empowerment, and that helped take us from human languishing to human flourishing. And once I saw that picture, I saw a key indispensable part of this is the abundant fuel. And it turns out it's super, super hard to create abundant fuel for our planes, trains, automobiles, all of these machines in our lives. It's actually really, really hard to create fuel that is affordable for a lot of people, that's versatile, that can do things like fly a plane and electrify things. That's portability is a big part of it. It's like really hard to actually do this. And I realized, that's why we're using fossil fuels. We're not using fossil fuels because we like them or because we just chose them randomly or because it's a habit or because it's an addiction. There's something that industry has done in terms of producing cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, this fuel abundance, that was really hard to do. And it's still really hard to do. And that's why we're using 80+% fossil fuels. It's not because we have a fetish for them or a habit. It's because it's really hard to produce the level of energy that we want with anything else.
So when did you decide that you really wanted to pursue that? Write a book on it, speak on it?
So in 2007, I gave this course on the history of journalism, and one of the segments was on Rockefeller. And so I started getting into it. I learned a lot about Rockefeller. And then in 2008, I gave a course on the history of the oil industry. And when I was researching the history of the oil industry, I would read about different debates throughout the history of the oil industry. And there are all kinds of debates about, for instance, foreign policy. And when I read these debates, I thought, oh God, I wish I had been there to debate this issue, because oil is the fuel of civilization. It's really the most important material in civilization because it's the most portable form of energy, and that just leads to so many things. So I just thought, wow, if I could have been involved in shaping the thought about oil, then that could have improved a lot of people's lives if I had been right and I'd been able to persuade people. And I thought, I can do that now. Like this issue of energy, I think people are thinking of it in very much the wrong way. In big part, they're not appreciating the benefits of fossil fuels. So if I can bring a better way of thinking to this issue and clarify it for people, that has a lot of leverage. Because if you think of energy as the industry that powers every other industry, it's better thinking can help the energy industry power the world more. And if we think badly about the issues, like if we think in an illogical way, we're even seeing today with, say, Venezuela, you think in an illogical way and a country can just totally crumble. And I saw it energy, this is the root of all of our productivity and prosperity and flourishing. And so it's really important to give it that guidance. And so that was the first time in my life that a specific issue interested me enough to say, I want to gain expertise on that.
So you wrote the book. What?
Well, that's a long period between
over time. You wrote the book.
So I started developing the ideas, and it's funny because the book, it's very unusual. The book was sort of it's interesting how it came about, because the book is published by Penguin, which is one of the major publishers, and it's unusual for a book with a title like The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels to get kind of a mainstream acceptance. I think one thing that I did that was valuable to that is that I would publicly debate different people. So I had this perspective, I should summarize the perspective, which is basically that if you look at our energy choices from a human flourishing perspective, and that includes you look at both benefits and drawbacks. You don't just look at the negatives or just the positives, but if you look at both the benefits and the drawbacks of our different energy options, human flourishing requires using more fossil fuels, not less. So the idea is not, oh, there are no drawbacks, there's no impact of CO2. That's not the argument. The argument is that it's a very net positive, and we'll probably go into more depth on that. But the core of my perspective was, the reason I think people aren't looking at this the right way is because they're not looking at it from a consistently human flourishing perspective. The way they're looking at the issue is they're primarily looking at in terms of, are we impacting the climate or not? So it's often defined as, oh, do you believe in climate change? And for me, climate change, that's not a very precise term, but if we would say the warming influence of CO2, that's a side effect of fossil fuels. That's a potential drawback. So when I look at anything, I want to look at the benefits and the drawbacks, but I don't just want to look at the drawbacks. So for instance, if I'm deciding on vaccination, if you say, do you believe in vaccine side effects? And I say, sure, I believe vaccines have some side effects. That doesn't mean I'm against vaccines, because I can think vaccines benefits outweigh those side effects and drawbacks. And so I have a similar kind of position with fossil fuels. And I think the reason people are so focused just on the drawbacks, and particularly climate, is that their focus is the idea that we shouldn't be changing the planet, that we should be minimizing our impact on the planet.
Right.
If we go back to my perspective is the planet is naturally deficient. It's not nearly a good enough place for human beings to live, including the climate is incredibly hostile to us. I mean, the climate is variable, it's volatile, it's vicious. People used to be terrified of climate. They prayed to climate gods. So nature doesn't give us this perfectly safe climate and then we make it dangerous. It actually gives us a very dangerous climate, and we need to make it safe. So I just came to totally reject this philosophy that the planet is perfect and anything we do is bad. And I had the perspective of, let's focus on human flourishing and let's change the planet in the best overall way for human flourishing. And so even if we make it warmer to some degree, but our lives are overall better, philosophically, that's a good thing. And I find that my perspective on this issue is really about a philosophical framework, not just I believe in different facts. It's that my framework is a human flourishing framework, and their framework tends to be an unaltered nature framework. And so I took that framework and then my beliefs about the facts, and then I would debate Greenpeace, Sierra Club, this guy named Bill McKibben, and that led an agent, like a particularly high-profile literary agent, to reach out to me and say, hey, I think this is a really interesting case. And then that's what got me the contract, because people often think, yeah, it's totally crazy that anyone would publish this. But I would encourage other people, like, if you think you're really right about something and other people are wrong, go debate it. It's just like I do Brazilian jiu-jitsu as a major hobby of mine. Like, if you think you're better at jiu-jitsu than somebody or fighting, like, you go out and fight them professionally. Like, if you think your ideas are better, go debate them. And if they're afraid, then that says something. But usually someone will debate you. And if you have something to say that's significant, maybe that will show a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And so how does that, to be perfectly honest, I don't entirely know, but how does it normally go for you? Like debating people or being out with this message for several years now? Because I can't imagine, it's definitely not the mainstream position to have.
Yeah.
You probably get a lot of blowback, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. It goes much better than people think, particularly as my position has evolved. So early on when I was debating, my position was still evolving quite a bit. And so there were a lot of facts I wasn't familiar with, and I just didn't have much experience debating with people. And I remember we used to do practice debates, like with different people, and someone who's now a colleague of mine, Don Watkins, who works for me. Like, I remember we did our first practice debate when I was debating someone from Greenpeace, and he just murdered me. And it was a really traumatizing, because I just thought, oh, like, I'm going to do so well. And he just brought out all this stuff, and I just had no idea. And he agreed with me, but he didn't agree with me in the fake debate. Like, he represented the Greenpeace position. He just killed me. But part of what I believe is, like, when I lose a debate, if I lose a debate, which hasn't really happened publicly, but certainly privately, it'll happen.
You're like, it's never happened.
No. I mean, like, losing is like, I try to really prepare. I mean, I like, you'll lose a bunch in private, but the question is, was I wrong? Like, to the extent I do badly, even if people think of it as a stalemate or I won, certain things won't go as well. I'll think of it like, was I wrong? or was I just not clear enough? And, occasionally I found out I think I'm wrong about some detail, but overwhelmingly I've thought, yeah, my human flourishing perspective is right, and fossil fuels are overwhelmingly good, and there's been something wrong with my explanation. And so my motivation is always, how do you explain it clear? And my belief is, to the extent whenever I am unsuccessful with an audience, I will just go back and think, well, how could I have explained it better? And so over time, what that's led to is I've had a lot of success. Now, when I talk to people, I have a very high success rate, I've lived in San Francisco, a bunch in the past several years. And you might think that's pretty hard, but I have a way of framing the discussion so that people will be open to it. And the basic thing I'm always doing is saying, look, would you agree that ultimately we want to take the course of action that's really best for human beings now and in the future? And then to do that, we have to look at the benefits and the drawbacks of all our options. We can't just look at the benefits of solar and the drawbacks of fossil fuels. We have to look at the benefits of fossil fuels and the drawbacks of fossil fuels, and the benefits of solar and the drawbacks of solar. And almost everyone will agree to that framework. And then once you've framed the discussion, then people are more open to the facts. But if the discussion is not framed with a clear goal and clear rules of thinking, then people will default to being very biased against fossil fuels and very biased toward solar and wind, even though that's not really what they want to be. It's just that's the default.
Yeah, I mean, I was telling you before we started shooting that I actually know very little about this topic on energy, the environment, climate change, the whole issue, and you're the first guest we've had on to talk about it. So coming into this, like, again, I'm trying my best at this point in my life to not really have an opinion on something that I'm just simply not knowledgeable of. But it's like you can't help but have this slight, I guess, bias a little bit, because it's all you hear is like fossil fuels are bad, or the earth is warming, global warming, climate change. Like it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's other people who are also pro fossil fuels, but you're the first one that I really know of. You're definitely the most prominent one I know of. And then I read your book. And you're right. I mean, you do spell things out in a very logical way. I really do appreciate the framework that you just said, which is you do a cost-benefit analysis of every form of energy, which I'll want to do in a little bit. Because for the average person, I consider myself in that, who doesn't know about this topic, it's a really good breakdown. And it's, from what I can tell, who knows what other people would say, but from what I can tell, like, you're looking at it from both sides.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting because in most issues, most of us are in the position of we lack expertise. So this is just a chronic issue. I actually have a whole podcast about this called the Human Flourishing Project. And it's all about human flourishing. But in particular, how do we actually know what's good for us in different areas of life, like nutrition and psychology? And so in any given area, we're going to be ignorant for the most part. But one thing we can look at, we can have an idea about ourselves is what's a good framework for looking at these issues. And then when we encounter people who claim expertise, are they really looking at it in a way that makes sense? So I'll give you an example. There's a guy named Michael Mann, who's a very prominent, I would call him climate catastrophist.
You're not talking about the documentary filmmaker?
No, not the director.
Got it.
But in climate, so this shows you're not immersed in this. You're immersed in one world versus another. Because like in the climate energy world, Michael Mann, he became a phenomenon for what's called the hockey stick, that's a whole technical subject. But he has a book. It's called The Madhouse Effect. I was reading it recently. I'm working on a new version of Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And one thing I wanted to do is I wanted to look for the best arguments against my position. I wanted to revisit them and revisit the state of them. And I was looking at his book, and he's focused on climate, and he'll talk about something like, here's how climate change is affecting food negatively. And I recommend just pick up that book and look at the section on food. And the whole thing you notice is the only thing it says about fossil fuels and food is negatives. And fossil fuels, they're warming the climate, and then that's causing negative impacts on food. And there's even a question of would warming cause negative impacts on food, but even leaving that aside. But there's this whole context, if you know anything about food, that food is overwhelmingly grown using fossil fuels. I mean, 4 decades ago, we were all supposed to starve to death because of a population bomb, because we were going to run out of food. And the thing that basically diffused that bomb and that allowed us to have more food per person, even though we have twice as many people as we did, is basically fossil-fueled agriculture. So we have natural gas that creates fertilizer that made agriculture much more abundant. And we have oil-powered machines that allow you to reap enough wheat for like 500,000 loaves of bread a day. It's basically tools and fuels, right? Before we had advanced tools and abundant fuel, we're farming by hand, or, we're using animals. And of course, we're going to be in terrible shape. But it's fossil fueled agriculture. Food as we know it depends on fossil fuel agriculture. So how can you possibly talk about food and fossil fuels and not mention those benefits and only the drawbacks? It'd be like someone writes a book about vaccines and health, and they only write about negatives. And you're like, hey, wait a minute, what was life like when we had polio and we had to be afraid of all of these things? Like, you have to take that seriously if you're thinking about this issue. So when I started looking at this issue, I noticed, oh my gosh, the whole thought leadership of what I would call our knowledge system in our society, they're so focused on the future risks of fossil fuels, but there's almost no focus on what is the beneficial role that it plays in our lives. That's one. And also how hard it would be to substitute for fossil fuels in that role. There's just this assumption, yeah, it's kind of convenient, but it's not that big a deal. Yeah, and of course we can replace it using solar and wind. And that's a really dangerously superficial view. And so what I would like the knowledge system to do, even if they disagree with me, is acknowledge the incredible positive role of fossil fuels and acknowledge how difficult it's been to substitute for them. And then if you claim, oh, there's finally a new substitute, or the drawbacks are now so big that it's not worth using fossil fuels, then I would buy that. But if you just give me a pure negative perspective on fossil fuels, then I'm going to think that you're really biased and that you're not going to give me the right answer.
Mm-hmm. So I definitely want to talk about, all of this. And I think for me, especially on this topic, because I don't know much about it, I actually really like hearing you take popular consensus talking points and then say your thoughts on that instead of doing exactly what you're just saying, which is talking about one side.
Okay.
But before we do that and talk about the different forms of energy, can you just lay out for us, this is probably like so common sense to you at this point, but can you just lay out like the role that energy does play in our everyday lives? Because like I mentioned before I read your book, I just never thought about it. Mm-hmm. And you talk about like life before fossil fuels.
Yeah.
The Industrial Revolution essentially is what I'm assuming you mean. Can you talk about that? Like the past versus now, the role it plays?
Yeah, and I think the key thing is, like, I call it kind of cutely tools and fuels, but it's really, you can think of it as like machines and fuels. So machines are basically these advanced tools that have a power source other than us. And I think it's important to realize that our whole modern way of life depends on these machines having a lot of energy. And that's why I find it helpful to look at the past and to see, before people had these high-powered machines, what was life like? And basically they had to live in nature. And as I mentioned, nature is a deficient place from a human flourishing perspective. It has very few usable resources. It's not the Garden of Eden, and it has a huge number of threats. And so what you need to do as a human is you can't just accept nature, you need to transform nature. But we're naturally very weak, right? We just have the tools of our bodies and then meager fuel supplies, and it's even hard to keep that going. So what we have to figure out is a way to get machines to do our work for us. And then those machines require a lot of energy. And so if you look at just all of modern life, just think about how much of our work do we have energy do for us? Do we have machines do for us? And there are good statistics like our machines do 100 times more physical work than we do. So our machines use 100 times more calories than we do. They use more calories so they can do more work, and they can also do different kinds of work. It's not like my physical body can display something on a computer screen. So we have this amazing phenomenon of we have these amazing tools called machines that can do every kind of work, but only if they have abundant fuel. And so if that fuel is not affordable, if it's not reliable, if it's not available, then our whole society is just scrap metal. And that's so when you're thinking about the modern world, it's important to A, appreciate just these amazing machines, and B, appreciate the fact that we have this incredible abundant fuel, which is because somebody has figured out how to produce that fuel in a way that is affordable and reliable for billions of people. And so every aspect of your life is these amazing machines powered by abundant fuel. Mm-hmm. And then the thing I would connect to that is it turns out it's very hard to produce that cheap, reliable energy for a lot of people. Like it's really, really hard looking at the history of energy. Lots of people have claimed, oh, I can do it using the sun, I can do it using the wind, but it's like super, super hard. And so so everything that's distinctive about our modern way of life in terms of how productive and prosperous we are, how long we live, how much control we have over our lives, that is so dependent upon this incredible energy abundance that right now, over 80% of that comes from fossil fuels. So fossil fuels, I should say, that's coal, oil, and gas. And the reason they're called fossil fuels is they are fuels that are derived from ancient dead life, like different kinds of plant and plankton life. And so what happened is the general theory, at least is historically, that different kinds of life, really like ancient dead plants and small organisms, were compressed by natural forces into a very, very concentrated fuel source. And some of that is coal that you can dig up. Some of it is liquid in the form of oil. Some of it is gas. But it has this incredible thing where nature has concentrated a lot of energy for us, and it's stored a lot of energy for us. And that turns out to be amazingly beneficial, because if you look at, think about solar energy, nature doesn't concentrate it very much. The sun is very dilute energy. So like the sun shining on this building doesn't provide all that much energy, and it's not stored. It's not reliable. We can't access it unless we build something like a big battery to harness it. But what nature did is nature built us that battery already with fossil fuels, because fossil fuels stored the sunlight in the form of plants and other organisms, and then that got compressed into these usable energy sources. So we have this incredible, naturally concentrated, naturally stored source of energy, and that's what's enabled us to get abundant fuel, and that's part of the reason it's so hard to replace. Now, my own very strong guess is that the thing that will replace it ultimately is another naturally concentrated, naturally stored source of energy. Because if we're dealing with naturally concentrated, naturally stored ancient dead plants, at some point you're going to run out of those because we're using them faster than they get generated by nature. But the amazing thing about nuclear power is that's even more of a concentrated and stored source of energy. Like the nucleus of an atom just compresses an unbelievable amount of energy. Just to give you an analogy, it's something like a golf ball of uranium, which is the material that you use for nuclear power, that contains as much energy as Yankee Stadium full of coal. And coal is incredibly compressed compared to solar. So there's just this fossil fuels, the fact that it's concentrated and stored by nature, plus the ingenuity of the fossil fuel industry, that has made it this unrivaled source of abundant power. And it's useful to understand when we're thinking of alternatives, because if you're dealing with alternatives that aren't naturally stored, aren't naturally concentrated, they have a huge uphill battle, because then human beings have to use a lot of resources to store and concentrate the energy, and that's very difficult.
So before we get even more in depth into the different forms of energy, can you give us a couple examples of what life was like before people realized they could harness fossil fuels and all these other sources into energy? You had a stat in your book. It was something like what percentage of people were farmers as their main job?
Well, at different points, 90% plus.
Really? Oh, wow. 90% of people were farmers, because that's how you got your food, was just because you had to manually grow it yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, you just think of it, I keep going back to like tools and fuels. Your natural tools are just kind of your body, and then you need energy. And right, to keep going to the next day, you need a certain amount of fuel for your body. And then, hunter-gatherers, they basically have their bodies, and then the food they can put in their bodies, and kind of all they can do to live most of their life is just use their tools and their existing fuel to get enough fuel for the next day to repeat the process. That's what life is, just like the pure pursuit of fuel. That's the obsession. So we always need fuel. And then so of course everyone's going to be focused on food. Like until you figure out a really efficient way to get food, everyone is going to be focused on food, because that's the absolute essential thing that everybody needs. And then, over time we come up with certain things, like people come up with like windmills and water wheels to grind grain, and that helps you. And you have different kinds of agriculture, so you have animal power. But even there, what happens is, so people, they can get a little bit of abundance, but then a drought or something happens, and then they have a famine. They're just still not very productive. Their productive ability is still pretty limited when they're relying on their own body's fuel and then the fuel of animals, because they have to spend so much time just producing enough food for themselves and their animals, and it's hard to even get out of that just stasis. And that's what human life is like. So that's why everyone's a farmer, because they're so unproductive that all they can do is produce food. It's not like everyone had a dream of being a farmer, right? It's if you think about human flourishing, so much of it is you get to choose the activities of your life. And just think about with work, like you and I have obviously chosen non-farming things to do with our lives.
You'd be surprised. No, I don't.
Right. So it's you think about that. It's so we spend so much of our lives doing productive work, and one of the amazing things to have in life is to have control over that, to decide, oh, I want to do this kind of productive work. I want to do this kind of productive work. But the only way that we can have control over it is if we have all of these amazing machines that can do most of our physical work for us.
Yeah.
So for instance, I came up here from Laguna Beach today, so it's probably 2 hours. Like, how long would that journey have been 200 years ago, right? And both of these places were not inhabitable in the same way. So we just had all of these amazing machines powered by abundant fuel that makes it possible.
Actually, that's a good point. Would California even be, or I guess what would living in California look like if we didn't have the machines that we have today? Because it's essentially a desert. Unless you're
different parts of it.
Yeah, different parts of it. But like, let's say, LA, that's super concentrated. Everyone wants to live here. Orange County, everyone wants to live here. Like, what would that even look like if it weren't for all the machines that we have? It's just an interesting question. It's like,
yeah, and there's a question of what did it look like? Concretely, but I mean, even so one of the advantages of one reason why people like here, like a big part of life, I think, is you get to choose where you are.
Right.
Now, there's a lot of natural features of this place that are very nice, including there are some things about desert type conditions that are very nice, and then there are some things that aren't nice. And when you have modern machine power, what you can do is you can take a climate that has certain attributes you like, and you can enjoy those, and then you don't have to deal with others. So for instance, particularly when you're dealing in the valley and other places, you can have air conditioning. I mean, imagine life in the valley without air conditioning. It's just a complete nightmare. And then you can have food transported to you. Like, you can have all kinds of food, even if it's not the best place to grow all kinds of food. And then, I mean, just, one thing I think about a lot is industry, how great it is that human beings have all of these different industries and that we have all sorts of interesting work that we can choose. But so much of that is based on transportation. Basically, people in one place can get together and produce one kind of good really well, like coffee. I don't drink coffee, but a lot of people like coffee, right? And other people produce computers and they get together. And so much of that ability to do what you want and to specialize and to be around people you like working with is the ability to transport those goods all over the place. So appreciating energy, I think, properly means just appreciating human flourishing, and in particular, appreciating the amount of control we have over our lives versus the amount of helplessness that we had when we were living in what you might call the state of nature. And I never get tired of thinking about how good is life now compared to how it was before, in particular because you have billions of people where they're still living in many ways in nature. Now, people around the world benefit a lot from our prosperity in terms of different, like if you look at life expectancy, it's a lot higher even in poor parts of Africa than it used to be, in part because of what the industrialized world has figured out and invented. But there's still a huge amount of drudgery, a huge amount of suffering, a huge amount of languishing. And then we also see with places like Venezuela, it's possible to go back, right? You can go from more flourishing to more suffering. So we really should appreciate how good life is, and then what makes it good, and then what are the fundamental causes of that. Because if you take it as, oh yeah, life today is just normal, and oh yeah, I heard fossil fuels have some bad stuff, so let's get rid of those fossil fuels, that could be like outlawing vaccines.
Right. It's like kind of the cliche of not having the right perspective.
Yeah.
Of not looking at things relatively.
Right. And it's so exactly. So what you need is perspective. And so part of perspective is you need a goal for your perspective. So the goal, in my case, I'd say like the goal should be human flourishing. We should be evaluating the state of our environment, the state of our lives, the state of our economy from a human flourishing perspective. And then another part of perspective is that you're looking at the fullness of the whole context of things. You're looking at the positives of something and the drawbacks of it. You're not just looking at a picture of the world and all you can see is a smokestack, right? You see like a factory and all you see is a smokestack. And that's what happens today. People, like they'll see a factory and they'll see a smokestack and they'll see something coming out of it and they'll say, I don't like that. I would like a world where that didn't exist. And they don't even usually know that's actually water vapor usually coming out of that smokestack.
Really? I used to do that when I would go surfing in El Porto, like near Manhattan Beach. They have those plants there. I don't even know what they are, what kind they are. But every time I drive by, because it's right on the beach, I'd be like, ugh, it just ruins the whole like natural beach scenery. And I don't even know what it is.
But that's a perfect thing. Like think about it. So I love the beach, and I go to the beach probably more than just about anybody. But I'm really aware, I try to be aware of what makes it possible for me to go to the beach all the time and to be relaxed. Like how can I go in the water every day and enjoy that? Well, if I just had to be a farmer all the time, working 16 hours a day, I certainly wouldn't be doing that. And if I were living in a primitive place, would I have a clean environment? No, I'd have an incredibly dirty environment. That smokestack, I would dream of that smokestack because I'd be living in human filth, in animal filth, with natural disease, natural bugs. Nature doesn't give us a clean environment. Like I say, it doesn't give us a safe climate we make dangerous. It doesn't give us a clean environment we make dirty. It gives us a very dirty and dangerous and unhealthy environment that we need to make clean.
Well, that's an interesting point, because if I think back to the early days of when, they maybe not even the Industrial Revolution, but when people started using coal for more energy or whatnot, you kind of think of the stereotypical like London dirty, what were they called? The chimney sweepers or just everything was like dirty, right? Mm-hmm. But it's like, I guess back then it's like, because they were doing it, apparently they did think that the benefit was worth the dirtiness of whatever, because they were doing it. I imagine if...
Oh yeah, the dirtiness... I mean, just overall, smoke used to be viewed as a positive thing. Like in advertisements, you would see a city. I think I don't know if I have a picture of this in the book, but I have a story about it in the book. I think it was Manchester. Like they would advertise smoke in the city as this is, no, because it's a sign of life. And it really is a sign of life because it's a sign of productivity. It's a sign of these machines helping you conquer, the naturally often very wretched state that we have to live in. So for them, it was natural to see the smokestacks in context. But as we got better and better, and as we could remove ourselves even more from the smokestacks, ironically, we became much more hostile to them, because then they think, well, I just want to go to the beach. I don't want any smokestacks anywhere, not in my backyard. And my backyard is the entire world. I don't want any smokestacks in anybody's backyard. Why do we have to have that? Versus, no, think of it as by the default state, you had really few resources and you had a lot of threats. Like that's how I think of the planet, as it's naturally deficient from a human flourishing perspective. We have very little in terms of the resources we need to live, and we have a huge amount of threats, including sanitation issues, filth, waste, disease. So that's the state. And what we figured out how to do is create these amazing machines and amazing fuel sources that could empower us to make our world much richer in resources, because we could take all the unusable raw materials and make them into resources, and then we could neutralize the threats. So for example, with disease, we can drain a swamp and help get rid of malaria that way, or we can come up with different kinds of chemicals that can get rid of different kinds of bugs. Or with climate, one example I think about is with a thunderstorm. A thunderstorm, like the same thunderstorm 200 years ago that would have struck terror into a community. Today, that could be like a romantic setting in a restaurant. It's beautiful, but it's, and I think it is beautiful, but only if we recognize that that's our mastery of nature using, modern high-powered machines. But I like to think of it as we have an unnaturally abundant planet and an unnaturally safe planet. But that's the planet we've created. That's what I'll often call the human environment. We've taken an environment, a planet that wasn't very suited to human life, and we've humanized it. We've made it much more abundant in resources and much fewer in threats. And if we don't look at things like climate change in that context, we have these bizarre views. Like we think of it as, oh yeah, climate's more dangerous than ever. And anyone coming from 300 years ago would die for our level of climate safety. I mean, they did die because of their level of climate danger. So if you're thinking about maybe fossil fuels have a drawback in terms of some feature of the climate is less pleasant, well, you better realize that it's made the entire climate more pleasant than anyone could have imagined 200 years ago.
Really? I mean, we'll talk more about climate change, but what do you mean about that specifically, that the climate now is better than it was 200 years
Well, but it's your experience.
Your experience.
But this is
Life.
like everything in life is sort of an interaction between, like there's the environment and then there's you. So take the thunderstorm example I gave, right? Like, how does someone experience a thunderstorm 200 years ago versus today? It could be the exact same thunderstorm. It could even be a more dangerous thunderstorm today. But today they'd experience the thunderstorm in a positive way, and before they'd experience it in a negative way. So it's their experience of the climate that's totally different. So when they came to our civilization, how they would experience climate was something they'd be terrified of and praying to all the time, because it could punish them. They would think of it as punishing, and it could also reward them, in terms of a bumper crop. And now we have so much control over our environment. We don't have to worry about it nearly as much. We're not nearly as dependent upon it. So yeah, we've mastered it. So that our level of climate mastery is something that was unimaginable 200 years ago, and thus the positive, like our positive relationship with the climate, is something that people would have never guessed.
So you're saying if someone from 200, 300 years ago came to today, their experience of the climate would just be a million times better.
Yeah, and all you have is really we talk about like the climate as this kind of isolated thing, but it's like this atmospheric system, and ultimately what matters most, I believe, is how individual human beings experience and how it either helps or hinders them in flourishing. So in terms of the livability of climate, life has never been better. And even if it was CO2 emissions were a lot more serious than I think they are, like, you still have to keep in mind fossil fuels, abundant fuel, gives you this incredible climate mastery ability that we don't want to lose, because whatever you don't like about the climate you forecast in 20 years, it's infinitely better than life was like for people 200 years ago.
So, okay, so let's talk about the different forms of energy. I mean, we just talked about how energy is not just important, but it's completely vital to our way of life. So this essentially is broken down into like fossil fuels and renewables, right?
No.
Oh, no.
No, because renewables is not a classification that I like to use at all. So, if you look at just a chart of what forms of energy do we use, the leading ones will be oil, coal, natural gas. And so combined, those, depending on the different sources, it'll be between 80 and 84% of all of the energy used by all the machines in the world. And those are what are called the fossil fuels. So oil, coal, and gas. And then after that, the two big ones are hydroelectric power and nuclear power. And then depending on how you measure it, there's also what's called biomass power. So different kinds of wood, but it's also often things like animal dung and things that we really don't want because they're incredibly dirty. But in terms of the major sources of power in the world, coal, oil, gas, those are the big three. Then after that, nuclear, hydro. And then after that, biomass, and I might have even missed one, but see, they're just so much smaller percentage-wise. And then after that, there's solar and wind. And the term renewable is confusing in many ways because it's often unclear what it refers to. Because does it refer to...
Okay, good. So it's not just me.
No. Because there's there's a bunch of terms you'll hear: alternative energy, renewable energy, green energy, clean energy, and like how do you make
like
sense of them?
Are they interchangeable or no?
No, not at all. And you need to, it's for purposes of classification. So one way you can classify energy is carbon-based and non-carbon-based. And if you're particularly concerned with CO2 emissions, the carbon and carbon dioxide comes from the carbon in fossil fuels, which are technically called hydrocarbons because they're hydrogen and carbon primarily. So you can think of it as carbon-based and non-carbon-based. And that can be a pretty good classification, although I should say technically it's tricky in the case of the biofuels because they are carbon-based, but the idea is that they absorb as much carbon as they emit, so they're considered carbon neutral. But so even then it's hard, but let's just say carbon-based, non-carbon-based. Or you can I just say hydrocarbon versus non-hydrocarbon. And so that would be fossil fuels versus alternatives. And then, but the renewable is actually, I believe, a really bad classification, because the one of the purposes of classifying carbon-based and non-carbon-based is that you're trying to avoid CO2 emissions, which we can talk about how important that is, but that's at least something to consider. But renewable doesn't capture all of the sources that don't emit CO2, because renewable definitely doesn't capture nuclear. So the idea of renewable is that it is naturally replenished by nature. That's the idea. Like nature replenishes it naturally. So this is a problem in a number of ways. So one is that there is no such phenomenon as an energy source that is replenished by nature. There are just portions of an energy source that are replenished by nature. So you could say the sun is naturally replenished, but all the materials that you use to convert the sun to the energy, those are all different kinds of finite materials. And actually today you're using fossil fuels basically to put all of those together. So there's no such thing as a fully renewable source of energy. They're just elements to an energy process that you can think of as renewable. So that's one thing. Another thing though is, why do I care if something is naturally replenished or not? Like, why is that a focus? And I believe it's a focus because people have this idea that we want to be as natural as possible, that we want to preserve the planet in some sort of pristine state and be in harmony with it. So they think, oh, if we're using natural energy from renewable sources, somehow we're in harmony with the planet. But I don't want to be in harmony with the planet. I want to be in mastery of the planet, because being in harmony with the planet means dying and suffering in harmony with the planet, because the planet is deficient. So my perspective is, I want the best sources of energy from a human flourishing perspective, just as I want the best computers. I don't want like a renewable computer, a renewable cell phone, a renewable house, right? I want the best. And part of the best is that it evolves. So if you did happen to run short on some material, then you use another material. Usually you just find better and better processes. So my focus is, what are great sources of energy now and in the foreseeable future, not which ones will be around in 5 billion years when the sun goes out. Like, I don't care about that.
Well, so what about those who would say that they also don't necessarily care about being in harmony with the environment, but they feel like we as a society should start to wean ourselves off of an energy source that may run out someday?
Well, I mean, what is someday? Like,
I don't know. You tell me.
But if someday, but we have a natural, like the energy evolution process, like weaning off is kind of addiction idea, which is part of like, they don't have the perspective that, no, we chose this because it made our lives amazing. It's just like, oh, it's unfortunate that we happen to be suckling on this particular source of energy. Like, and so first of all, no, it's not an addiction. It's a healthy choice that we're making. So, and it's the best choice for billions of people. So that's part of the context. If you're doing something that's really improving your life, your perspective is not, oh, let's figure out a way to get off that. Your perspective is there anything better than this? Or is there some really immediate thing that's going to prevent me from taking advantage of it? And so from a supply perspective, fortunately, there's not anything immediate. Like we're actually having more and more and more what are called reserves of coal, oil, and gas. And that's basically because nature has just produced an astonishing amount of these raw materials, and we're better and better at finding them and refining them. So practically, like for decades and decades and decades, there's no particular concern. And if there was a concern, then that just works through the price system. Basically, if it starts to become expensive, then the prices go up, and then you look for, other ways to produce them or alternatives or something like that. But we don't have the perspective like, oh, do we need to wean ourselves off steel because how long is that going to last? We just have the perspective of, let's use the best metals we can. And then part of that is, if the producers of those metals can't do as good a job over time for whatever reason, then we'll find alternatives. So I think that you don't think of life in terms of, I want a renewable thing. That I believe that's a kind of religious perspective. It really has become a religion where people are saying, we demand renewable energy versus no, we demand the best energy. So I think you should be thinking in terms of, you want the best energy for human flourishing. And then it's a legitimate question, how do things like CO2, but also conventional forms of pollution factor in? So are those drawbacks of fossil fuels, like factor those in when you think about fossil fuels, but not from the perspective of you want renewable energy, from the perspective of you want the best energy. But that's why when you're looking at these alternatives, the renewable people, they exclude nuclear. And so nuclear is something we know tens of thousands of years at least worth of the stuff.
Well, real quick, before we go on to nuclear, while we're talking about the supply of like fossil fuels, what are your thoughts on that? Because I can't think of any specific numbers off the top of my head, but I feel like there are some, predictions out there that it's supposed to run out in, what did they say? The world is supposed to end in 12 years or whatever.
That's a different.
It's supposed. No, that's different. But I'm just joking at what they say. Like they say it's supposed to run out fairly quickly. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so part of the reason I'm glossing over this a little bit is because in terms of the today's top concerns about fossil fuels, this idea of depletion, that's the idea. Like we're depleting it too quickly. That has fallen out of favor. But it's worth noting that for decades that has been the primary focus. So people have said we need to get off fossil fuels because we don't have enough of them. Mm-hmm. And now they're saying we need to get off fossil fuels basically because we have too many of them and we're going to use too many of them.
Oh, so you're saying we've just found more?
Yeah. So you think of it as, so there's an important relationship when you think about the planet between a resource and a raw material. And people tend to think of the planet as abundant in resources, whereas it's actually abundant in raw materials. So, because I mentioned that the planet is naturally deficient. It doesn't give us much in the way of usable resources. A resource is something that's available to you to benefit your life. Like naturally, not much of the planet is all of that useful to us. That's why we lived very short lives. And that's why people who live in primitive places still have very short lives. But what the planet has a ton of is raw matter and energy that the human mind can convert into useful form. So if you think about something like oil prior to the 1850s was useless glop. It wasn't, no one would have considered a natural resource. It was a natural nuisance. Mm-hmm. It was naturally useless. And actually people would sometimes run into oil and think, oh God, I ran into oil. I don't want oil. Like they'd be trying to get salt water and then run into oil and it would be bad. And that's because it was a raw material, but it hadn't yet been transformed into a resource. So the way to think of it, and that's not just true of oil as such, it's true of different forms of oil. Like there are different forms of oil, for instance, oil that exists in what's called shale rock, which is it exists very tightly, so it doesn't flow easily. And that was useless until pretty recently. So they knew that there was more of that stuff in the earth than all of the oil we had used in the entire history of civilization, but they thought of it as useless. But then what's called the shale revolution has happened, and then people figured out ingeniously how to get oil from that very tight rock, and now that oil is a resource. So the way to think of even oil resources is that don't think of it as, oh, there's just a pool of oil and it was valuable and we're sucking it out of a straw. It's more like, no, there's this incredible ocean of it in different forms and all of it was useless. Like it started out as zero value in this insane quantity and we figured out little slices of it, how to make it valuable. And what's happening is we're figuring out bigger and bigger slices. But not only that, it's even cooler than that because you also have coal and gas. And using technology, we can also actually convert coal and gas to the liquid fuel that we get from oil. And then maybe you could, in different ways, we might be able to manufacture it from other things. So the amount of like potential resource of oil and the other fossil fuels is unfathomable.
So you're saying essentially you're not worried about it. We're constantly coming up with new technology to extract more of it, to turn it from, like you said, a resource to, a material to an actual useful resource.
I'm worried about, all my worry is about not being free to use it. And that's generally true of how I think of resource. I'm never afraid of running out of something. I'm afraid of running out of the freedom. Because as long as you have freedom, then you can use a given raw material to its best known use. And then you can also investigate other things. So with oil, like you think of it as oil, but really what we want is what's called liquid hydrocarbon fuel. That's like what we're mostly using in our cars. It's this unique liquid fuel, and it mostly comes from something in the ground we call oil, which we then refine / purify and make into this. But really all we care about is this liquid hydrocarbon fuel. And the idea is you can get that. There are more and more ways to get that from what's called oil, but then over time we can also get it from coal. We can also get it from gas, but then we can also be free to investigate things like over time, we can improve batteries, and then certain uses of oil can be more efficiently displaced with batteries, or maybe we'll get better at certain uses of plants might be better for certain applications. A lot of this comes down to scale. Like, certain, like with plants, for example, like French fry oil, like, you use French fry oil from a restaurant or waste alcohol from beer, that can actually be a good source of energy, but it doesn't scale to billions of people because fortunately we don't eat that many French fries, right? Or drink that much beer. That would be a big problem. But so it's not, we can work on that. But that's unfortunately, that's all made with fossil fuels, which they don't, so it's like the waste product of a process that's fueled by fossil fuels. But the point is not that, I have a fetish for fossil fuels that we should use them for everything. The point is that we have this massive need for abundant energy. And right now, for most of the needs of the billions of people who have access to energy, and then for most of the expected needs of the billions of people who want it, fossil fuels are by far the best tool for the job. But part of what happens is if that changed because of supply issues, then we would have ample time and warning to explore other ways of doing things. So I'm never afraid of running out of resources. I'm worried about running out of the freedom to create resources out of raw materials. And I keep coming back to nuclear, but a huge thing with nuclear is we haven't been free to really pursue nuclear because it's been demonized by the same core group of people who are against fossil fuels. And so what you have with nuclear is this is by far the most proven way we have of generating abundant energy, at least in the form of electricity, for a lot of people. Like it's better than anything else in a whole bunch of ways. It's naturally concentrated, naturally stored. But the modern environmental movement has been incredibly hostile to it, and it's been so taken over by governments that we really have no idea of its potential. And so what I want a world where the fossil fuel people can keep innovating there, and the plant fuel people can keep innovating, and the solar people and the wind people, and certainly the nuclear people, where they can all keep innovating, and then we can have energy evolution. But what's happening, because we have this bias toward renewable, which is really this kind of nature worship, we want to be in harmony with the planet, because we're pursuing this goal of being in harmony with nature instead of human flourishing. We're excluding not only fossil fuels from real consideration, but we're also excluding nuclear. And thus, if CO2 was really a big issue, the biggest villains would be the green movement, because they've elevated, instead of focusing on non-carbon energy, they've focused on renewable energy, which turns out to be the least promising. And they're also against hydro. They're against large-scale hydro because they don't think it's in harmony with nature to have a big dam. And I think there are reasons to not want to build big dams sometimes, but if you think that there's a climate crisis and you recognize the importance of energy, you should be more than willing to build big dams.
Like if you think the world's going to end in 12 years,
but you recognize that the world, but it's interesting we talk about the world ending. So for me, the world ending is getting out of the current, for me, the world ending would be life going back to the way it was 300 years ago. I mean, that's much worse than because people have this idea like, is the planet going to explode? I think Ocasio-Cortez said, no, I didn't mean it was going to explode. Yeah, but you're saying it's going to get horrible. But the baseline should be life without the energy that today we get from fossil fuels. Life without that energy abundance, that is hell. Like that is hell. And billions of us could not be alive if we didn't have the level of energy abundance that we get from fossil fuels today. So if you're talking about the world ending and let's get rid of fossil fuels, you have to recognize, but you're depending on fossil fuels for life as you know it. So when people recognize, nature is deficient, 7-8 billion people cannot survive in anything resembling a natural state, then you start fearing getting rid of fossil fuels as the end of the world. And you think, even if it got 5 degrees warmer, that's cakewalk compared to lack of energy.
Well, so let's go back to nuclear. Mm-hmm. I know that Steven Pinker is also a big advocate for nuclear energy, I think. So why aren't people for experimenting nuclear energy more?
Well, so what you really need is not just experimentation, you need the freedom to develop it to the point of commercialization. So I met a really bright nuclear entrepreneur a couple of years ago, and I won't name him because he might not want this view ascribed to him, but we were talking about how we both had the view that nuclear energy is the safest form of energy ever invented. I think that's just empirically true.
That's what Steven Pinker says too.
Yeah, it is just empirical, and it's very logical. The basic reason is because nuclear, it cannot explode. And most of the danger from energy, particularly our conventional sources like fossil fuels, is explosion. And even with hydro, like if a dam explodes, that's actually the most dangerous thing that we know of that can happen with any energy system is like a dam exploding. So you could kill 100,000 people with that. And so what's happening is a sudden freak accident that people have no time to respond to. Whereas what happens with nuclear is that material cannot explode. It can what's called melt down. It can overheat and it can melt down. But that gives you hours to days of time to get away from the threat. That's kind of the short version. It's this non-explosive thing. So there are physical reasons. And then empirically, it just in terms of deaths per unit of energy generated, it's by far the lowest. So my belief then is if we're going to be fair and look at the benefits and drawbacks of everything, we need to have a level playing field in terms of the safety laws. Nuclear cannot be held to 100,000 times higher safety standards than other things. Because you think about in life, if you raise a safety standard too high, you actually make life dangerous. So if I said to you, for example, like, you know what, to be safe, what you need to do, Michele, is you need to hire 3 bodyguards at all time, like to be truly safe. And let's say, you're working on this show and you're working on your career, and like, I'm assuming you're not
can't go anywhere without people recognizing me.
But I'm just saying, like, assuming you're not incredibly wealthy. If you are, just someone switch the example, right? But like, but how are you going to afford 3 bodyguards, right? It's like, it's really expensive. And then if you have to pay those bodyguards, then your life is going to be incredibly expensive. It's going to cut down on food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, right? It becomes unmanageable. And the same thing is true for a nuclear power plant. If you just make up and you say, well, I need extra safety, so let's put in an extra guard and an extra monitoring system, it's like adding those bodyguards. And at a certain point, it just becomes unworkably expensive. And so that's what's been done to the nuclear industry. They've demanded this completely arbitrary level of safety from it. And so they've made it cost prohibitive to build it. And then I really object to this. Many people in the green movement will say, oh, see, nuclear is so expensive. And it'd be like I said, oh, see, your life is so expensive, but I forced you to have these bodyguards that you didn't need. So the belief is that if we had a truly free market where nuclear was held to the same safety standards as everything else, that's what we really want to see. That's what I have a lot of optimism about. And that's what we need, because we don't just need nuclear working on a small scale. What we want it to be commercialized so you can use it all over the place. So unfortunately, we're really, really far from that, because it's been so controlled by government and it's been so opposed.
So why are they putting on so many restrictions and regulations on them? Because they're worried about was it Fukushima, like these nuclear plants that I don't even totally know what happened. I just know that there was like radiation everywhere. It was disastrous. Right. So is this what they're thinking of? Like, that's where they're going?
That's interesting though. Like, you think of it as, oh, Fukushima, and that stands in your mind as like a really strong thing and maybe a scary thing. And you don't think as much about like, oh, even, even there are accidents with people in their homes who have solar panels, and solar panels actually make it worse for your home in a fire, because during the day, if the sun is coming down, you're shooting electricity through and you can't stop it. And so it makes, so sometimes you can't, there are all these, so people don't talk about benefits and drawbacks equally. So we just have no clue about the actual state of these things. So what happens with nuclear is the most demonized. So whenever there's any accident related to nuclear, people think, oh, this is why I was worried in the first place. But 0 people died from any kind of...
Oh, really?
From radiation, the only thing is a couple people died in like a physical accident, I think falling. And then what people do die from is forced evacuations, because if you have a population, particularly a lot of elderly people, and you scare them and you move them really quickly, that's where you get some deaths. But generally, because nuclear can't explode, you have these non-existent or very, very low death tolls, which any other energy would want. But so what's happened is the public has been very scared. So they've come to think of nuclear power like a nuclear bomb. But the real villains behind it are the thought leaders, particularly the environmental thought leaders in our culture, because they've perpetuated the myth that this is a uniquely dangerous form of energy. And so my question then is, well, what causes them to do that? And it comes down to what I would call their nature worship. They think of nuclear as unnatural. They think of it as unnatural to split an atom and to power things via radioactivity. And we can talk about the waste in a second. They think like it's wrong for us to create this waste because it lasts a long time. So they have this whole hostility toward it. And then they that hostility makes them feel comfortable because they think it's wrong for us to tamper with nature, as they would call it. It makes them comfortable exaggerating or even making up negative things about nuclear. And I would submit that those of you who like nuclear and who recognize its benefits and who recognize how small its actual drawbacks are, consider the possibility the same people who are ignoring nuclear's positives and exaggerating their negatives, maybe they're doing the same thing to fossil fuels too, because of an underlying ideological bias. So just like people, I believe people have a bias against changing nature, and that's why they're so upset about CO2 emissions. Not because CO2 emissions are that big a deal, but because they think it's wrong for us to change the climate. But it's a moral duty. It's not a scientific assessment that this is actually the biggest priority for human flourishing. It's they think they have like a commandment, like their tablet says, thou shalt not change climate. Thou shalt not alter nature. Thou shalt not split the atom. That's what the green movement is. It has this whole duty to preserve nature in a state that hasn't been affected by human beings. So I believe that's the driving ideology that makes people feel morally justified in opposing things. And then in practice, they don't feel much compunction about scaring people about them.
So let's talk about the sources that they do push, solar and wind. Mm-hmm. I didn't know until reading your book that apparently it's, well, I did kind of know, but I didn't know how little it actually does fuel our everyday energy use today. I mean, it's like, tiny, right?
Yeah, about 2 or 3% of the energy in the world. So it's important with energy. There are a couple of different types of energy that we use, like different forms of energy. And so we use energy for direct heating, which is a huge thing because cold is actually, contrary to what people think, cold is a much bigger problem than warmth in the world. So a huge amount of energy is home heating, but also industrial heating, you're melting metals and stuff like that. So direct heating is one major use. Another major use is mobile fuel. And that's mostly liquid fuel. So like planes, different kinds of trains, most cars. And the reason is because when you're on the go, when you have portable fuel, you need a super concentrated form of fuel because you're carrying your fuel.
Right, you can't just like carry coal around or...
Well, you can. I mean, coal is actually pretty concentrated. So that's why they had steam shovels and coal trains. Now, oil is more dense than coal. So that's why we tend to use oil-based fuels now. So we have liquid fuel, we have heating, and then we have a lot of electricity. And electricity is amazing. I mean, electricity it's the most versatile thing in the sense of it can ultimately power any kind of machine that you can imagine. Like there are a lot of machines that work with electricity that obviously wouldn't work if you didn't have electricity, like all the computation machines and digital, right? Those are all just totally electricity based. But it's important that if you're trying to substitute for fossil fuels, you need to substitute for their ability to heat, and you need to substitute for at least what's being done with liquid fuels. And there are potential ways to do that, but it turns out that they're very hard to do. So with solar and wind, one thing is when you hear statistics, you're hearing just statistics of how much electricity they generate. But that's actually just, I don't have the exact, but let's say that's around 1/3 of the world's energy use. I don't have it off the top of my head, but it's around 1/3 of the world's energy use. So sometimes you'll hear, X% of our energy is coming from something, but they actually mean electricity. But it's not the same thing because electricity is just a portion of energy. Another thing that happens with solar and wind, this is an even bigger distortion, is that because solar and wind are what are called they're intermittent fuels, so they don't come in a continuous way. Fossil fuels and nuclear are naturally stored, but solar and wind aren't. So in the middle of a sunny day, they'll generate a certain percentage of the electricity on the grid, whereas in the evening, they'll generate almost none. Or in the case of wind, when it's calm, they'll generate almost none. So what people who are being really disingenuous will do is they'll take the peak of sun and wind, the peak percentage that it's generating at that moment, and then it'll say, we're generating that much of the electricity. And then they'll actually say, we're generating that much of the energy. Right. So it's like, I'll give you an example. I think I cite this in my book. This guy, Bill McKibben, who's one of the leaders of the anti-fossil fuel movement. So I quote him in, I think it was 2013 or something like that. He was talking in December and he said, Germany is getting 50% of its energy from solar and wind. Well, actually, he might have even just said solar. And if you actually look at what was happening is that there was a spike of solar and wind in June. And he was in December, but I think he had gotten the statistic from June. And so he had taken that spike and then he had equated it with all energy. And so like actually they're producing even now, let alone then, less than about 5% of Germany's energy is coming from solar and wind. And they've invested like over 500 billion in it. I would say squandered over 500 billion in it, but it was producing less than 5%. And yet he could say over 50% because of these distortions. So if you're just as a consumer of knowledge, you just want to ask, what percentage of the overall energy use are we getting from a certain source? And if you hear somebody say, oh, on Monday at 3:15, we got this much from renewables, they're really lying to you. Another thing they do, by the way, with renewables, when it's convenient, they'll add in wood and hydro, even though generally they're against large-scale hydroelectric power, but they want to have an inflated renewable figure. They'll add in the hydro and then they'll add in the wood. And one of the things is people don't want to acknowledge that wood is a much better source of power right now than solar and wind. It has all sorts of problems, but it's reliable. It's stored. Now we have to create it. We have to farm it in effect. And so that makes it expensive to grow and have a bunch of other issues. But at least it's reliable. It's on demand, whereas the solar and wind aren't. So what you'll find is Germany uses a ton of wood, and they'll have mandates for renewable energy. So what they'll do is they'll just buy a bunch of wood chips from US companies, and then they'll burn them. They'll freight them across the ocean using like fuel oil.
Yeah.
And then they'll burn them. And I'm laughing about this. And I know some really smart financiers who make a killing off this idiocy. But of course, people think, oh, we're using solar and wind and we're powering our world. No, actually, you're using fossil fuels to build the solar and wind, which are doing a pretty small share of things. And then you're also using fossil fuels to grow the wood and to chop it down, to ship it across, and to burn it. Also, you can say that you're not using fossil fuels.
So I guess what would you say to the people who are really trying to push the renewables, push the solar, push the wind? They're saying, okay, I'm fine with using fossil fuels to build the infrastructure for this now so that hopefully we can get it to a point where it can be running on its own. Do you think that's realistic or?
Theoretically, but it's important to recognize, this is true, by the way, with the battery cars, what people call like electric cars. Like if you're saying, I want to reduce CO2 emissions, you need to take seriously what that process is. So if you have a process, so for example, to build out what they call the Green New Deal, I mean, it's not actually a possible thing because it's basically saying, let's use 100% unreliable electricity to power everything in our lives. So it's a delusional thing, but it's worse than that. But if you think about it as like just the raw thing of building all these solar panels and wind turbines and batteries, leaving aside the fact that you can't do it, that would be the biggest, that it wouldn't work once you built it with anything resembling current technology. But like that would be the biggest fossil fuel operation in the history of the world. Like, so that would be a massive spike in CO2 emissions. So at least you should acknowledge that as part of your process. And then you should say, well, we have somehow, but we're going to get off the fossil fuels. Like we're going to build this totally self-sustaining renewable thing. Like you should at least acknowledge the whole process. And the same thing is true with the battery cars. Like the battery cars do not in any meaningful way reduce CO2 emissions. Because what happens is, so notice that the battery cars are more expensive than the internal combustion engine cars. So when something is more expensive, that's a good indication of the fact that it uses a lot of energy, because energy is a big expense for a lot of things. A lot of what makes something expensive is it takes a lot of energy to produce. So why are the battery cars so expensive? Well, because they have to manufacture these very large batteries, which still don't store nearly as much energy as liquid fuel does. So that takes a whole bunch of energy. And then because those don't store very much energy, they need to make the cars a lot lighter. And lighter metals like aluminum take many times the energy that, say, steel does. So they have to make lighter metals. So what's happening is all of these manufacturing processes, when people study it, it basically amounts to no savings in CO2. So somebody is buying a Tesla, and then they're not actually saving any CO2. Now, you might say, well, I have an argument that in the future that this will save more CO2 because once everything else is, but you should really be clear that you're not doing it now. And because it might make sense if CO2 is your focus, maybe it makes more sense to use, say, natural gas cars right now, because natural gas is usually the lowest CO2 emitting source of electricity that people are getting. So maybe just burn it directly in your vehicle. It's a lot cheaper to have a natural gas vehicle than a battery vehicle. And so maybe that would emit less CO2. So my point is that part of looking at the full context of something is that you look at the entire process for everything you're concerned about. So if you're concerned about CO2, you have to look at the entire process. And what I'm pointing out here is that the advocates of renewables and battery vehicles, they're not at all acknowledging the full process, even by their own goal, alleged goal of reducing CO2. And what that makes me think is that they're being opportunistic for some other reason other than they really want to reduce CO2 emissions. Versus I think that if they did want to reduce CO2 emissions, they'd be very focused on something like nuclear. Because if you have nuclear, what you can have is you can have a reliable, what's called base load source of power that you can do a ton of work with. Like basically everything that comes from that plant will not have emitted CO2. And so you can have like this stake in the ground where this is the foundation, and then you can start making batteries in this thing. You can start making metals with this. And guess what? If you make the batteries and the metals with nuclear, then there won't be nearly as much CO2 emissions. But notice, Elon Musk is the person who's the most outrageous here because he's so brilliant in certain ways and I think so virtuous in certain ways. And yet he is encouraging more than anyone this renewables fetish we have. He will not in any serious way endorse nuclear, and yet he should know above anyone that if you actually want to reduce emissions, that you should be using nuclear now. You shouldn't be using these parasitical, unreliable sources that are really just expensive ways of using fossil fuels right now.
That's interesting. So to build these electric cars, I never thought of that they're using so much fossil fuels to manufacture them in the first place.
That's why they're expensive.
That's why they're expensive.
Yeah.
Okay, well, before we jump into the actual topic of climate change, which is kind of the reason why fossil fuels is such a hot button topic in the first place, can we do like a quick rundown of the hydro energy? Because I didn't even know that was an option. I don't totally know what that is. I know it's water, but can you just tell us quickly what that is, since that's an option out there?
Yeah, so remember I talked about with fossil fuels and nuclear, they have sort of these three attributes that make them incredibly promising as sources for energy. So one I mentioned is that they're naturally concentrated. So nature concentrates a lot of energy into the fossil fuels and certainly into the nuclear material. And also they are naturally stored. So we don't have to do the work of concentrating sunlight and storing it into some sort of battery. Nature already created this amazing battery for us and it filled it up. So that's like, now you have to do certain things. You have to figure out a way to release energy. So that's what we have to do with fossil fuels and nuclear. Basically, we have to find it and we have to release it, but we don't have to concentrate it and we don't have to store it. Now, hydro is sort of like fossil fuels and nuclear in that respect, because think about how heavy water is. Like water is really annoyingly heavy, and this, particularly for women in the poor parts of the world, this is a huge problem because they'll spend hours and hours a day, just lifting a huge pot of water. And that's their life. That's their subsistence, right? I mean, that's part of, they're just fueling themselves for the next day. So you think about it, it's so hard to lift up water. But if you can lift up a ton of water to a really high point, there's a huge amount of stored energy in that water. And what you can have is that water, historically, you would turn a wheel. So like the water would flow down in a river and it would turn a big wheel. And then that wheel would say grind grain. So that would be a source of power. And so what we have now is hydroelectric power, which is, it turns what's called a turbine, which is that's the basis of many of our technologies. Essentially, you use a certain amount of motion and then that'll create electricity or some other thing. And in the case of hydro, you're almost always creating electricity.
Okay,
so in effect, this water wheel.
Essentially like wind turbines, but water.
Yes, but much, much more concentrated because the power of the water is much more than the power of the wind. And if you can store it if you're in a place where it flows reliably, then it doesn't have this intermittency problem. It has, relatively speaking, at least, much higher reliability. Now, it's not perfect, because you can have a drought and then there's an issue there, but it generally has this quality of it's naturally concentrated, not as much as oil and nuclear, but it's quite concentrated and it's quite stored. But what happens is the evaporation of nature does your work for you. So what's happening is water flows to the bottom of the river. This is a slight simplification, but basically there's evaporation, and then that brings water up to the top of the river. Now, if we had to carry it ourselves, it would be completely unaffordable, right? Because we'd have to carry up the water, and then we'd be getting energy from the water that we used energy to carry ourselves, right? But the secret of all the good sources of energy today is that nature does all the work to put the energy where we need it. So nature did all the work to create the oil and coal and gas, and nature did all the work to create the nuclear material, and nature does the work to bring water to the top of the river, or we can store it in a hydroelectric dam, but it's still nature giving us the water, and then it can flow down, and then it can turn a turbine, and then it can generate electricity. So where this exists, it's a pretty amazing form of power. The issue is you don't always have the geographical locations you need. So in certain locations, it's really, really good as a source of electricity. But nuclear is different because a nuclear power plant is much more portable and replicable. So the nuclear material is very dense, so it's easy to carry around. So you can technically build a nuclear plant anywhere in the world pretty easily. So that's what it has in common with the fossil fuels, with coal, oil, and gas. If you want to, you can build a facility. Because those are so concentrated, you can move them anywhere in the world, and you can create a power plant anywhere in the world. And that's definitely true of nuclear as well. With hydro, you depend on certain geographies, so it'll always be a pretty small percentage of the world's power. But it is a really good one, and the fact that the green movement is generally hostile to it is revealing.
So yeah, then why are they hostile to it? Because I can understand your point of it's just inconvenient in some areas, so some people can't take advantage of it.
Yeah.
But why would people actually be against it?
Well, I mean, a dam, if you want to talk about intruding on nature, which is not quite the way I think of things, but there are often very beautiful areas and rivers and stuff that are dramatically affected by dams. I mean, I would when I was a kid with my family, we'd go whitewater rafting certain places, and the guides would often complain about, oh, they dammed this river and it affected this river and it affected this species and stuff like that. And sometimes I think this is very illegitimate and they just hate any kind of industrialization. But I'm sure there are dam projects that, displace a lot of people. It's notable that if you're talking about impacting nature, hydro has a much bigger impact on nature in terms of just the land than fossil fuels and nuclear. Interestingly, arguably the things that most impact nature from a traditional land use perspective are solar and wind, because the fuel they're using is so intermittent. So that's why you have like wind turbines all over the place, and you have these huge amounts of solar panels, different places. Now, if those were really good sources of energy, I would think that it was worth it to do that. But it's notable that there's a certain kind of contradiction, because people are saying, oh, I want these natural sources, but these sources interfere most with your enjoyment of nature. And I think the answer is the people promoting them aren't actually interested in the enjoyment of nature, which is a big part of the human flourishing perspective. They just think of nature as something that we shouldn't touch. And so in terms of priorities, they want to attack our main source of energy and our main source of impacting the world, which is fossil fuels. And they don't really care too much about it being replaced. So they just say, oh yeah, we're in favor of solar and wind. And they don't even really think through what that means. But because a lot of solar and wind projects in practice get opposed by environmental groups. So it's not like, and that's going to be one of the obstacles in building them, is that to build them, and also you need huge cables to connect them to one another and to population centers, you have huge environmental opposition. So the modern environmental movement, which it's not focused on maximizing human flourishing, it's focused on minimizing human impact on nature. If you're for minimizing human impact, you will oppose every form of human impact on principle. So it's not like they're actually, for the same reason they're not actually enthusiastic about nuclear, they're not actually enthusiastic even about solar and wind in practice. And this is reason number 150 why something like the Green New Deal is terrifying. Because you have people saying, oh yeah, I got this plan and we're going to build everything with solar and wind and batteries. And like, they have no idea how weak batteries are compared to what you would need. But also, you're not even going to be allowed to build the things because you're going to get opposition in every specific place. So it's just terrifying to me that we've got this amazing, unprecedented energy abundance today, and people have no appreciation of its positives, no appreciation of how hard it was to build. And they just think it's just a matter of, oh yeah, let's just use the sun and the wind. And they just have no idea how difficult that is and what it would mean concretely. And so I'm just afraid that they're going to restrict fossil fuel production, and they're not going to replace it with anything.
Yeah, I never thought about that. When you drive down whatever highways and you see these areas with all these wind turbines, if you're saying they're only taking up about 2 to 3% of energy usage now, and they're taking up, they just go on for forever.
Oh yeah.
And if that's only supplying 2 to 3%, then if we were, let's just say 100%, whatever it is, I feel like in theory that would mean you'd have to have a massive amount of turbines everywhere.
It depends on what you mean by massive. So it's not that there's not enough space for it at all, but it would be, certainly it would be a major feature of different people's lives, particularly because all of these weather-based forms of energy like hydro, but particularly solar and wind, they're very location specific, because solar tends to be places that are sunny, which people often like living in such places, and then places that are windy. There's just a whole, parts of the Midwest and people live in them. So if these ever became really superior sources of energy overall, it's hard to imagine that. But if they did, then I would think, yeah, these drawbacks are worth it. Yeah. But my problem is that people aren't looking at the full context of these different things. So, and so it's just totally misrepresenting our alternatives. And then what'll happen is what the green movement, I believe, wants is they want us to oppose nuclear, oppose fossil fuels, oppose hydro, and then have this fantasy of solar and wind. And then when we start pursuing solar and wind, if we really did seriously, they would find reasons to oppose that. They'd say, well, look at all the, it turns out in practice, it's just a total pain in the ass.
Then how would that even work? If you think they would reject everything because no matter what, that would be an interference on the natural environment.
Yeah.
What does that mean? No energy? Like, what would that lead to? No energy source?
Well, it leads to an increasingly primitive way of life. You look at Venezuela, not for mostly these reasons. It's mostly like a more conventional collectivism. But that was a fairly wealthy country, at least by South American standards. And it had a big oil industry. And now they can barely produce oil and they have outages. And the average person has lost something like 20 pounds there. They can't even fuel their bodies.
They have no food.
Yeah, so you just look at in terms of they've gone from human empowerment to human helplessness, right? They've gone from these advanced tools powered by abundant energy to their tools have no abundant energy. So you think, well, that's deindustrialization. So they are actually living the green ideal. Venezuela has become one of the greenest nations on Earth because they're impacting nature a lot less. Just like number one nation is probably North Korea. And they should get Environmental Hero of the World Award from the green movement. There's a little graphic that someone who follows my work made years ago, and it just showed the North Korea at night. And it's basically the dictator's house has a light, and then everything else is dark, right? In South Korea, you just see all this light. And I ask people when I speak, which is the greener place, North Korea and South Korea, which has had less of an impact on the world? And obviously, North Korea has had very little impact on the world. And yet we talk about having little impact. So one of my big goals here is I want to just switch our goal. Our goal should be maximum human flourishing, not minimal human impact. And so part of flourishing is you want to avoid negative impacts, but negative impacts for human beings. So you don't want to cause unnecessary and destructive climate changes if you can avoid it. But it's because you care about human flourishing. It's not because you're against impacting nature, because to flourish, we need to impact nature massively. And what we see with Venezuela is they're having a lot less impact on nature. And that is not a good thing by a human standard.
Okay, so let's talk about climate change then, because again, this is kind of why this is a topic in the first place, an issue. Right now, you've been talking about the Green New Deal. There's a huge push for lessening CO2 levels. Can we just kind of go over the foundations of global warming and the greenhouse effect CO2? I think these are buzzwords that the everyday person hears, but we might not necessarily totally know what they mean.
Yeah.
So do you mind giving us like global warming? I think we know people are saying that the world is getting warmer. What are the details of that?
So I'll give you it from my perspective of what I think we should investigate and be concerned about. So my overall perspective is we should be doing the things that most advance human flourishing. And the livability of our climate, its impact on our life has an effect on human flourishing, a huge one. And part of that, and I think the overwhelming part, is to what extent do we have the machines and fuel to take the naturally dangerous climate and make it safe. So climate is naturally dangerous, but we also want to avoid increasing its natural danger level if we can. So you can kind of think of it like a disease. The first thing is if you have a disease that's rampant, you want to be able to cure the disease, but you want to avoid spreading the disease even more, making it, you might think with antibiotics is a good example. Like you want antibiotics to be able to deal with different kinds of bacteria, but you also want to avoid making the bacteria worse, which is actually with antibiotics, that's actually a real issue. And so what people are claiming with fossil fuels, which is at least worth investigating, is basically, they're not mentioning the good part of it, but from my perspective, they're saying, yes, fossil fuels have made us much safer from climate, but at the same time, tragically, they're making the climate more hostile. So I think that's the coherent version of the argument versus the incoherent conventional version of the argument is just fossil fuels took our perfect planet and ruined it and we hate them and blah, blah, blah. Like there's no coherent version of the argument that doesn't acknowledge the huge benefits of fossil fuels, including that fossil fuels have made climate much more livable. But then if we look at it in the context of fossil fuels have these benefits, but then the question is, are they making the climate much more hostile? And then the mechanism of that is when you burn fossil fuels to produce energy. They're called hydrocarbons. So they're made of hydrogen and carbon. And basically when you burn something, you're splitting it apart, and then oxygen is attaching to each atom. So you basically get water vapor. That's why with smokestacks you see all this water vapor. And then you get carbon dioxide that comes out. So the H becomes H2O, water vapor, and the carbon becomes carbon dioxide, CO2. And by the way, if you want to understand why things like smog happen, it's because the fossil fuels ultimately come from plants, and plants don't just have carbon and hydrogen, they have things like nitrogen and sulfur. And so what happens is when you burn them, the oxygen will attach to the sulfur and become sulfur dioxide. And with enough of that, you get smog. And with the nitrogen, you can have different kinds of nitrous oxide. So it all comes from, you're taking these hydrocarbon plant things and you're burning them. And so the reason we love them is because we get so much energy from them. But then there's this water vapor. People aren't too concerned about that. But then there's the CO2, which people are concerned about. And then there are these other byproducts, which people are historically concerned about. And you should be concerned about. Like all things being equal, you want to avoid smog. So let's just focus on CO2. So the idea of CO2 is CO2, when you isolate it in a laboratory, is what they call an infrared absorber, although people often call it greenhouse gas, which is actually not a very good term because they think of it as like if you put glass on a greenhouse and it gets warmer inside, but that's not really what's happening.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, so what's happening is it's certain molecules are good at absorbing a certain spectrum of light called infrared light. And so the short version of it, sun shines on the earth, and then the energy that hits the earth will basically, theoretically could just hit the earth and bounce off. And then it would just be like when the sun was on, it would just bounce off, and then otherwise it would just be freezing cold all the time when the sun wasn't shining. But we have this atmosphere, and part of what the atmosphere does is it traps some of the heat, and including in this infrared form. And so what this greenhouse effect or infrared absorber effect does is the molecules in the atmosphere, what they basically do is they slow the exit of the energy from the sun. And so they maintain it longer. And so it like kind of drags out. And that's what makes it a lot warmer on our planet than it would otherwise be. And then what's happening is let's say in the year, so throughout history, we've had different levels of what are called these I'll call them greenhouse gases, even though it's not quite the right way to think of them. We've had different levels of them. So for example, today we have 0.04% or 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And historically estimates are we've had at least 10 times that amount, maybe 20 times that amount. Yeah. And then, people don't know this because nobody gives context. And those were warmer periods, in part because of the infrared heat trapping effect, but notably they were incredibly fertile periods. I mean, this is like when dinosaurs were around. You think about what kind of natural plant life like we can barely survive off natural plant life. Imagine dinosaurs. How are dinosaurs survive? Like these huge things. They have these massive plants. So you have these very fertile periods, but often warmer periods, so there's not a perfect correlation at all between these greenhouse gases and warmth, but we know that when we isolate them, they lead to more warmth because they trap a certain amount of heat. But then there are other things going on too that will make it warmer or colder over time. So basically, before we started adding CO2 to the atmosphere, it was about 0.03% of the atmosphere. And since we've started adding CO2, it's gone up to 0.04%. And people are concerned it'll go from, and it will if we keep using fossil fuels, to 0.05%, 0.06%, because it lasts a little while in the atmosphere. It doesn't just go out immediately. So what we have is rising CO2 levels. And then the concern is that those what they'll call heat trapping gases, that will increase temperature. So that's kind of one thing, is that the heat trapping gases will increase temperature. And then that temperature will not only be undesirable in and of itself for many people, that will cause other climate changes, such as rising sea levels, which is probably the most dangerous theoretical one, increased drought, and then associated other things that people talk about. But so the key idea, the place where there's agreement, is that these are heat trapping gases. The places of big disagreement are, how good are they at trapping heat? Basically, are they trapping heat to the point where it's going to get a lot warmer by going from 0.03% to 0.04%, or is it just going to get a little bit warmer?
Because it's still releasing the atmosphere, but the idea is just not as fast.
Well, it's the energy that goes. It's called an energy balance, but it's not like it gets trapped. Nothing gets trapped permanently. Right. Energy is always coming in and going out. Life as we know it just means the energy is slowed coming out, and so it's not like it's just stuck here forever, because it ultimately all dissipates. But it takes
longer, and while it takes longer, we're just sitting in it.
Yeah. I mean, people there are different analogies that people use, but I can't think of any. It's just kind of. But I mean, yeah. So it's not like anything is permanently here. But yeah, as long as the CO2 level is here, basically it's warmer. But part of the context is we've had much higher CO2. Not we as humans, but other species have had much higher CO2 levels. It's not like the Earth just gets hotter and hotter and hotter and it burns. It's just a lower, higher average temperature. And so right now in the history of the Earth, we're quite low in terms of CO2 levels from a historical perspective. And we're actually, you start to get major plant death problems when you're at about half of our current level and 2/3 of our previous level of 0.03%. So once you get to 0.02%, you actually start running into a bunch of problems with plant life, and then animal life depends on plant life. And then once you get below that, it's a big problem. And then, we've had 20 times higher. So it's in terms of life on Earth, we've seen that it can thrive and flourish with much, much higher CO2 levels. So then the question should be, how does that affect human life? Because the coherent version of the catastrophe argument is not that the planet life will not be able to live. That makes no sense given what we know about the history of the planet. The argument is that the rate of change is too fast and that we will not be able to adapt to it. So for instance, it's not like the sea levels be intrinsically so high, but that we already built cities at a certain level and that we won't be able to adapt to it. And it's not that, it'll be intrinsically too hot everywhere, but we moved to places and it's going to be too hot in those places. But that depends on so there are really three things it depends on. If you believe in catastrophe, a significant, a rapid rise in temperature, B, significant increase in climate hostility, and C, human inability to cope with it. So those are the three pieces of the catastrophe puzzle. But it's important, all of these are pretty strong. So they have to say rapid rise in temperatures, significant increase in climate hostility, and then inability of us to deal with it. And so my basic focus is on part 3, that our level of climate mastery enables us to deal with just about any kind of climate change. And actually, humanity already flourishes in every kind of climate imaginable today, from swampy Florida to polar Alaska. And so my starting point, even before I look at the specifics of the science, is that it would take a lot for me for a climate change to be on the top of my list of human flourishing priorities. Because on my list of human flourishing priorities is 3 billion people have virtually no energy, which means that they can't flourish in any kind of significant way. So for me, that's a catastrophe. Like human poverty, almost half the world living in an impoverished state, that's the end of the world. I mean, from my perspective, if I lived there, it'd be the end of the world for me. So I think of that's the end of the world for those people. So for me to weigh it becoming warmer or more storms or sea levels changing or droughts, like for that to rise to the level of the importance of energy is very hard for me to imagine. And then when I look at, and what I notice when I look at the thought leaders on this issue is none of them at all acknowledge our level of climate mastery, and they don't focus on it. So they don't focus on the need for energy in general. They don't put much weight on that. And they don't focus any weight on the need for energy to master climate in particular. And what I notice, and my argument is that just as they are biased in ignoring the positives of fossil fuels, both in general and for climate mastery, so they have a tendency to exaggerate the negatives. So I believe that we do have a warming influence, that it may cause some other things, although that's really don't know as much about that, but that it is far smaller than the catastrophists say. So it's certain, if you just someone watching this, if you look at the catastrophists, you can be certain just from listening to me and from common sense that they are almost totally ignoring the climate mastery piece of the puzzle and the fossil fuels and human flourishing piece of it. Like they're obviously biased about that. I think once you have this perspective, what you can't know from me directly is, am I right that they're exaggerating the negative significance of rising CO2 levels? Although even there are hints. For example, they don't tell you that they used to be much higher. They don't pay attention to the fact that there's a lot of global greening, because the more CO2 we have, the more greening we have. They don't pay attention.
Greening meaning?
More growth in plant life around the world. Like you have places that have been untouched by humans that are dramatically greener than they were before, and that's attributed to CO2. It also helps with crops a lot in general. So if you just know from grade school, CO2 tends to increase plant growth, and somebody tells you, if you just know two facts about human history. One is that human beings are usually too cold and want it to be warmer.
I'm always freezing. And we have a running joke here. They turn the air on to like below 80 and I freak out.
Yeah. But even all humans, not just women who have a reputation for being cold, right? But it's like human beings are generally like, they generally have more problems with cold than heat. Like we die much more from cold than heat. So that's one thing. And two is that CO2 causes plant growth. So those are just two kind of basic facts you know. And so when you hear a rise in CO2 levels, and you don't know anything about fossil fuels, but you might think, well, aren't some human beings going to benefit from it being warmer? And particularly once you learn the warming actually occurs nearer to the poles, so it's the people who are already cold who are going to warm more. It's not so much people in Arizona. So you learn that, and then you learn, that you might expect some people will like it being warm, and there'll be more plant growth. And then you notice that everybody talking about the issue doesn't mention that at all. It's not that they say, yes, of course, many people, it'll be more pleasant, and yes, we'll have this benefit of plant growth, but the disruption from the rate of change will be much worse, and that'll outweigh that. They don't give you that context. They just act like we sinned against the climate gods. We put CO2 in the atmosphere. They usually make it black, right? They'll put like these black clouds, even though CO2 is invisible. And then it's like the climate had a smiley face, right? And then it has a frowny face. Like that's the narrative. So it's very religious kind of narrative. It's like, we shouldn't be impacting climate. It's like the tablet said, thou shalt not impact climate. Then we impacted climate, and therefore nature punished us. So this is the opposite of like a human flourishing cost benefit analysis, because they're not looking at human flourishing in any kind of serious way. They're not looking at any potential benefits of CO2, let alone fossil fuels. They're only looking at negatives. And I think thus, if you can see how much of a distortion is going on there, it shouldn't be very far-fetched that they are exaggerating the negatives. And then particularly if you read chapter 1 of Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, it talks about what I call the secret history of fossil fuels. And it points out that many of the thought leaders on this issue today have a 30-plus year track record of arguing that we were already going to have a climate catastrophe. So the climate, when you hear, 12 years remaining, that kind of thing, well, we were told that 12 years ago, 24 years ago, 36 years ago. So there's a whole track record of making these predictions. And that's another thing that you're not told. So if somebody makes a lot of bad predictions and they don't come true, they should own up to that. Even if they think they're right, they should own up to there's something wrong in my method that made me premature. And yet, if you look at today's thought leaders, there's no owning up to all the catastrophic predictions they've made. So what I think this makes my theory even more plausible just to somebody watching. Obviously, they can decide for themselves. But my theory is that the framework of prioritizing minimal human impact over human flourishing and having this view that the planet is perfect versus and that we shouldn't touch it versus the planet is deficient, that it's that philosophical framework that's causing people to ignore the positives of fossil fuels for human flourishing and exaggerate the negatives. So that's my explanation of, because people say, like, how can you, 97% of scientists, like, first of all, 97% of scientists did not say there's a climate catastrophe, or let alone even climate scientists. But the way lots of smart people can be wrong is they can have a framework for their thinking where either they have the wrong goal, and sometimes an unclear goal, they have wrong assumptions about how the world works, like the planet is this perfect Garden of Eden, or they can have bad methodology, like they can be biased. And so if you have a goal of an untouched planet, if you have an assumption that an untouched planet is a Garden of Eden, or if you have any kind of bias, particularly where you look at so-called at technologies that impact the world a lot and you think that they're going to be bad, then you can look at a technology that is the most valuable technology in the history of civilization, and you can be mad at it. And that's what's happened with fossil fuels. It's from a human flourishing perspective, it is the most valuable product in the history of civilization, and yet people hate it. And they don't say, yes, it's the most valuable product of civilization, now I'm worried about it. There's just this huge hostility. Like, I mean, imagine somebody being grateful to the oil industry. Like, you don't see that. And it's not that, it would be one thing if they said, oil industry, thank you for, only reason I'm alive is because of what you, the oil industry, did. I can enjoy my life. I can be with my friends. I can do the work that I want. I can take time off. Like, thank you, oil. Like, you are some of the, I owe my life to you. But unfortunately, now we see either that now we have better alternatives, if that were true. Unfortunately, it's not right now. But, or that there's a big problem that wasn't a problem before. Like, today's CO2 level rise is going to be a bigger problem, much bigger problem than yesterday's. That's a coherent argument. It's not a coherent argument to say, fuck you, oil, and you're fucking up the world even more, which is basically what the culture says today. I hope we didn't get screwed on the privacy, the profanity policy of YouTube.
No. We don't care about that.
Mature audiences.
We're again screwed over either way. It doesn't matter. So I guess to kind of wrap up, what do you think about the future of this conversation? Because, you've laid out your case for why fossil fuels are beneficial for human flourishing today.
Yeah.
What do you think this means for the future if we are consuming fossil fuels like we are today?
Well, I mean, my focus is to get people to think about the issue from a human flourishing based perspective so that we have the freedom to do it, because we need the freedom ourselves. I mean, we in the wealthy world, and then certainly people in the poor world need the freedom to use fossil fuels. And that's very much in jeopardy. When you look at, say, the Paris Climate Accords, which is a commitment. Now, it's not actually a binding commitment, but it's a commitment to say we should reduce emissions by 80+% in the next 30 years. Now, if you see a graph of CO2 emissions, and if you compare it to a graph of life expectancy, if you compare it to a graph of income, and if you compare it to a graph of how many people are alive, which means how many people the planet can support in its current state, they are all hockey sticks. So no CO2 emissions, way up. Life expectancy is like 30, way up. Income is really low, way up. Number of people the planet can support, like 1 billion, or way up. So if you have those graphs, I call this the human flourishing hockey stick, and you see that, and then somebody says, with this thing that correlates, and then they say, boom, like they want it to go down 4/5 of the way. Mm-hmm. And then you know that even where we are today, only half the people in the world have that. So we want it to go up, a bunch more. That's really scary. So we still have massive energy scarcity in terms of human flourishing. and then people are saying the one major source of energy abundance, let's massively cut that off as our top priority. That's a terrifying thing. And it's more terrifying to me that this was regarded as morally incontrovertible by the world. So this is not a controversial statement that Donald Trump is a controversial president, who many people object to many policies of. And yet, even as much as people objected to in different ways, for many thought leaders, Trump withdrawing from the Paris Accords was the worst thing that he had done in their eyes. You know, I remember one that hit me hard was Bob Iger, who's the head of Disney and who is, you know, a really good friend of Steve Jobs, who's an idol of mine as well as of many other people, and seems like a great guy from what I can tell in like many ways. And I saw him tweet about it, and I just said, like, I'm resigning from Trump's presidential business council or whatever it was. Like, I need to take a stand on principle. And I'm just thinking, like, what are you, like, your whole business is human flourishing, but particularly in terms of the emphasis on enjoying the abundance of time that's made possible by fossil-fueled civilization. Like, I think of fossil fuels as they give us a longer life and then control of the time in our lives. And so we get to do the activities we want to do with the people we want to do them with and the places we want to do them. Like, watching a Disney movie is an incredible luxury and, like, in a good sense. But he just, in his mind, the way he's been taught to think of it, he has no connection between that and fossil fuels. He just thinks of it as, yeah, of course we get energy, and we shouldn't be getting it from fossil fuels. We should be getting it from something else. But the real problem is CO2 has gone from 0.03% to 0.04%. Like, that's where I take a moral stand. It's like, no, why not take, like, what about the level of, I don't care about the level of CO2 nearly as much as I care about the level of human flourishing, the level of access to energy. And the point is that for a really smart, conscientious guy, this wasn't on his mind even. So to me, and he's supporting what I believe is a murderous policy. That is, if this policy gets passed, you will be able to directly or indirectly, but probably pretty directly, point to a lot of Venezuela type cases where you just see massive suffering. And then a whole bunch more cases where they never industrialized because they didn't have the opportunity to, because the poorest people need the most fossil fuels. You'll have just had this destruction, but Bob Iger will have been part of it. And, like, he seems like a nice guy. So to me, that shows that the thinking is still so bad that there's a lot of room. And so my own focus is, I'm actually, at some point next year, the next version of Moral Case will come out. And for me, I'm spending more time on the new version than the first version, because the first version influenced a lot of people. But my premise is it's much more true than influential. So I'm trying to figure out, how do I, if I explained it at a 6 level before, in terms of doing the issue justice, maybe I can do a 9. So that's my own focus is just, I've looked at the arguments again, I've reviewed it, like, I'm more convinced than ever about the core of the argument. So then the only thing I can think of to do is how to make it better. And then in more places, which is part of the reason to come on shows like this.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, Alex, is there anything else that you feel like we haven't covered that you want to get out there? I mean, I know you've been talking about that. You talk about this all the time, but yeah, is there anything else?
So one topic that came up in the pre-show that might be, I think I have an unusual perspective on. I guess I have an unusual perspective on a bunch of things, but we were talking about business models in the sphere of people with ideas, and often people ask me, what's your business model? In part because they have this idea that at least before they hear me explain my views, that the product of me saying things like, I love fossil fuels, that was a devious conspiracy by the oil industry. You know, they sort of hand-picked me and then gave me some gold-plated lifestyle as long as I was willing to sell my soul for this kind of thing. So I mentioned, like, historically, I didn't even have any background in this. I didn't even know anyone in the industry. When I started coming to these ideas, I didn't know anyone in the industry. But over the years, I have part of the way that I have a team of people at my company, the Center for Industrial Progress. One thing we deliberately set out was to work with the industry, but in a very different way than people conventionally do. So people conventionally work with industrialists, in a donor-recipient relationship. And that has a lot of benefits. But basically, they'll go to somebody and they'll say, hey, look, I'm fighting for your values in the world. Cut me a check. And that has there's a lot of good things done that way. There's a lot of issues with that too. I was interested in something different. What I was interested in is, what I really wanted to happen was I wanted to see if I could get the companies to start teaching both their employees and the public the human flourishing case for what they do. So I wasn't interested primarily in the money. I didn't want money for me to speak. I actually wanted them to pay me to tell them how to speak. So, I didn't want to be like a mouthpiece, right? I wanted them to be the microphone, but a willing microphone. Because what I suspected is that there are a lot of people in that industry who know on some level that they're doing something good, but they don't have the words for it. They were never trained in these arguments. They haven't explored these issues. And so that undercuts morale hugely with the employee base. If people work in an oil company who grew up with what I grew up with, I mean, I can't even imagine, because meaning for work is just like, I've only ever wanted to do work that I totally believed in, to the point where I was willing to work as hard as I needed to work.
I feel like it's used as an insult to people now, to be like, well, they were, politicians or lobbyists, whatever. Well, they work for the oil company.
Yeah, exactly.
With the oil company, it sounds bad. It sounds if you don't know,
Well, it depends on how hopefully oil will sound different, because it's like, oh wow, they work for the oil company. That would be good. But yeah. So my goal was to create a big part of our business where we basically helped with what they call the messaging of the industry. So that's basically the content that they deliver to their key audiences. So one is, what's the content that they deliver to their employees? What messages are they giving them? And the idea was, I want the employees to learn the moral case for fossil fuel. And so one thing I do is I go speak a lot of places, but I'll definitely speak at oil companies too, or coal companies, or gas companies. And I'll talk to the employees about, this is how I came to the conclusion that even though I had nothing to do with it, this is how I on my own came to the conclusion that what you do is good. And how the key to this is not, like, it's not any particular fact. It's more the framework of looking at it from a human flourishing perspective. And so if you look at it from that perspective, then I think you'll have a lot more appreciation. And then the other thing is, sometimes, although not a lot of times, companies and I'll agree with them on policy. Unfortunately, a lot of times companies do what's called rent seeking, which is they'll ask for special favors for themselves. Like the oil guys will try to screw over the solar guys, or the solar will try to screw over nuclear, et cetera. And so I'm pro-freedom, so I don't want to get involved in that. But sometimes there are cases where I think it's just the oil companies are having their freedom taken away. And so what we decided to do is talk to the executives and say, hey, for this particular issue, like, let's say I wasn't involved in this, but the example would be like, we didn't have the freedom to export oil for a while, and they fought for it and fortunately won it a couple of years ago. Like, we can help you make this case. Like, we can use the human flourishing approach to explain to people why exporting oil is good for their lives. So, and this is something that's historically, this kind of function of helping with messaging is historically done with PR firms, But my view of that is, A, I never wanted to be a PR firm because I only want to advocate for things that I believe in. And B, my problem with the PR firms in this is they don't even usually believe that the companies are good. So if they haven't even convinced themselves that you're good, how are they going to convince anyone else that you're good? So my company, we've got a team of people, and part of what we do is we help companies that we agree with on messaging. And there's a lot more work to do there, just as there's a lot more work to do with the public. But I hope that other people in other industries get into this. I hope that people think of, if you have a generally positive view of industry and you have good arguments for them, maybe create a business model where you can give them the words they need when they need them to make the case for freedom, to make the case for their activities and human flourishing. Don't just go ask them for donations. I mean, that can be good too, but donations are, my own personal experience is, if you have a really good business model, that gives you a lot of freedom. Like, I have the freedom to spend an ungodly amount of time working on a book because I have a business model, whereas I know a lot of people who have controversial views and they have a donor-based model, and they just always have to worry about the donor yanking out the funding. And like, if they do something controversial, it's like in 2016, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, I think it was 2016, yeah, they had this case against Exxon where they're basically, the narrative was Exxon knew that climate change was catastrophic and they didn't tell anyone, which doesn't make any sense. A, because I don't believe it's catastrophic, but B, how can a private company have specialized knowledge of climate science? Like, it doesn't make any sense. But they named me on the subpoena. Now, I mean, they said, Exxon, if you've ever had any communications with Alex Epstein, release all emails. So there was nothing I was afraid of at all, but I resented the idea that they are asking for alleged emails of me. So I emailed the Attorney General, and I wrote, the subject line was like, your demand to seize my emails or something like that. And the text was, fuck off, fascist. And that was it.
You wrote that?
Yeah, I wrote that to her. And then I publicized it on Twitter and stuff. And that's the kind of thing where like one angry donor, like they could just say, oh, I don't approve of that. That's not what my money was intended for. And it's really nice if you can have the freedom to think and say what you want. And I hope that, we were talking in advance of this, I hope that, with the rise of Patreon and other things, I hope that there are like broader bases of supporters who give more people the freedom to really just act on their conviction.
Right. Because the whole thing came up because we were talking about this whole space that's happening with online shows, more independent, producers and, productions like ours, and just the different emerging forms of revenue. There's the obvious ones like, Patreon, I think the more traditional like Kickstarter and all that. But then there's a lot of like other crypto options or browsers or things like that. And so anyway, we just started talking about business models. So that was interesting that for you to talk about yours.
But so I happily take money, as they say. Like, I happily take money, but proudly, this is the point, like proudly take money or charge money to the fossil fuel industry. And I hope that more people emulate that. And I hope they should really question if they have a negative association in dealing with the industry. This is the industry that powers every other industry that makes our lives possible. So A, having a negative association with fossil fuels is, you should question. And then B, having a negative association with industry. You should question, because fossil fuels and industry are essential to human flourishing.
Right. Well, Alex, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. Like I said, you're the first person to come on to talk about this. I'm sure we'll have many others with different perspectives, but I'm just happy to get the conversation started.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for having me.
Of course. We'll have to have you back when your new version comes out.
All right, sounds good.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.